Hey everybody, I am making this video in response to a question I've gotten really over the past couple years since I've been doing this YouTube thing. Um, I've gotten repeated variations of the question, how do you read so many books? Or how can I get better at reading? Or how can I develop my reading habit? Or what are your reading habits? I get variations of those questions somewhat regularly, and I'm a little reticent to give any broad advice because I kind of don't feel like I am qualified to do that. But I've gotten the question enough times that I thought I would at least offer some thoughts. I'd offer a little bit of my own reflections on my own reading habits, how I approach reading, how I think about reading. Because if it helps any of you watching this, if it helps you develop your own love of reading, then that's great. That's why I do this whole YouTube thing, is because I love reading and I like helping people find books. I think that reading is an extraordinarily important habit, extraordinarily important aspect of being a healthy person. If you can devote the time to reading, and so I want to support that as much as I can. And so I thought I'd put this video together to hopefully do that. So that all being said, I'm going to offer, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to offer three kind of overarching thoughts about kind of my attitude and posture towards reading in general. Just three overarching pieces of, I don't know if you'd call it advice or just thoughts. And then I do want to offer five. After that all being said, those are kind of my overarching caveats to this whole video. And then I want to offer five much more practical pieces of advice, like practical, pretty nuts and bolts kind of pieces of advice if you decide that you want to develop your reading habits more. Some things I would suggest. So let's dive into it. So, okay, the first thing I want to say, and this is pretty important actually. Reading is like a lot of other habits and hobbies and skills. It's just not necessarily for everybody. And I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to pander. I'm not trying to be patronizing. I'm not trying to anything like that. I'm just really acknowledging that there are lots of hobbies that are not for me. Reading, however, is something that I love and I've gotten good at, and I just think that it's certain people's temperaments or wiring or interests or makeup or even season of life. All these variables can come into play. Levels of ability, all that stuff can come into play as to say that reading may or may not be for everybody, and that's fine. And I think there can be this weird dynamic around reading, and I feel this very frequently. I feel actually a little weirdly shy about talking when I'm in face-to-face conversations with people and the subject of reading comes up. I feel a little wary of getting too much into it because frequently there's kind of a moral import or an intellectual import weighted into comments about how much you read and how many books you read or whatever. What I'm trying to say is that I never want anyone to feel like they are less than, intellectually less than, maturity wise less than. I never want anyone to feel less than just because they don't read or they don't read as much as me. I never want anyone to feel that way because I try not to feel that way about anybody else. I don't think that how many books you read. I've definitely known a lot of very emotionally immature people who read a lot, and so all I'm trying to say is that how much you read is not a measure of how good or worthy of a person you are at all. It's not even necessarily a measure of your intellect or your intellectual, abilities. There are a lot of remarkably intellectually gifted people who just don't have access to books and can't read that much or whatever. So that's probably my biggest overarching thing about this whole video, is that if you don't read or can't read that fast or can't read that many books, just don't beat yourself up. Don't feel bad about it. Conversely, if you can, don't puff yourself up. What I'm really interested in is helping people who have the skill, the desire, the ability, the space in their life to read more, to help them do that. And that's it. There's no other judgments beyond that. So take that for what it's worth. That's my big overarching caveat to this whole thing. Two more quick thoughts. I do think that and I'll say more about this as I get into the practical pieces, but if you want to get better at reading, you have to think of it as a skill to develop. It's not a switch you turn on or off. It's a skill that you develop over time. In particular, it took me a while to get to where I'm at now. It's honestly, it's like getting in shape or working out or learning a language or learning to play a musical instrument or getting better at a sport. All those analogies. Just sheer amount pace and amount of reading and reading comprehension, it's a skill that's developed just like any other skill, and just like any other skill, it takes time. And so you need to give yourself a runway. You need to give yourself time to get where you want to go. You need to, and I'll get into some goal setting and stuff like that in a minute. But really, it's important to primarily understand that reading is a skill to be developed, and you need to give yourself some like grace and patience to get to where you want to go. On the flip side of that is, just like other skills, that once you develop them, it's very, very rewarding. It's very rewarding to be able to sit down at the piano and play. It's very rewarding to, so people tell me, be really good at a sport. I'm not the most athletic person myself, but yeah, it's a skill. It takes time to develop. You need to have it. The reason I say that is because it can be quite discouraging to think you're going to just jump in with this really ambitious, unrealistic goal. It can be quite discouraging to actually undermine your efforts to get better at something that you want to get better at if you have this misguided kind of approach towards it. Okay, the third general overarching kind of thought to this whole project is that it does mean, again, the skill analogy is important here. It means if you're going to want to dig into this, you're going to need to sacrifice time and energy for other things, most likely. Unless you're frittering away a ton of time on surfing the internet right now, or social media, or whatever, like that might be easy to sacrifice time and energy to devote towards reading instead. But for most people, it is going to require, I mean, we all have finite amount of time and energy in any given day, and if you want to get better at reading, you're going to need to reallocate some of that time and energy towards reading, which means you're going to need to sacrifice, give up other pursuits, other hobbies, other interests potentially. For me, again, I hesitate a little bit to get too much in this because I don't want to sound condescending, or like I'm puffing myself up by any means. But just here's the reality. For me, I'm a person that I love playing video games, for example. I used to, rather, which you can see where I'm going with this. Like in college, I loved to just sit down with friends and play whatever, Halo, whatever it was for the time. I pretty rarely play video games anymore. I just don't. I don't put the time towards that pursuit. I've largely, even though I put videos on YouTube, I really, really don't surf social media. I spend very little time on news feeds on social media anymore. Honestly, I don't really watch. I watch maybe one movie a month, maybe. And I watch the occasional show on streaming services, but not very often. It's not unusual for me to go multiple days in a row without even turning on a TV, honestly. And so I say that all to say that because I've gone through the effort to redevote time and energy towards reading, those other things just don't get my time and energy anymore. And that is what it is. So I'm putting all this up at the front because, part of what I'm going to encourage you to do if you really want to get into reading more is to do like a time audit, like evaluate what you're spending time and energy on, and is there anything that you would prefer to see that put towards reading, then you're gonna need to get rid of it. I'm really, what the point of I'm trying to get at here is that reading is not something especially if you want to get really good at. If you want to read 100 books in a year, you're probably not going to just add it on to whatever your days currently look like. You're going to need to make some moves, make some shifts, redo your time budget, so to speak. So those are my three overarching thoughts. Reading's not for everybody, and that is okay. That is fine. If it is for you, though, you have to think of it as a skill to be developed over time. And then third, you're probably, if you're like really want to get to reading 100 books a year, for example, as a goal, you're just not going to add that onto what you're already doing. You're going to have to make some changes to your daily rhythms. So let's get into my 5 pieces of practical advice. All of that being said, 5 pieces of hopefully very practical advice here. Number 1, the very first thing I would say is use some sort of tracking system. So I use Goodreads. I like Goodreads mostly just for the purpose of being my tracking what I read. And whenever I finish a book, I mark on Goodreads that I've finished it. I give it some sort of rating, even though I don't care that much about the star ratings, but I give it some sort of rating, and then I try to write some sort of like paragraph at least of my thoughts on the book. And that serves more as my reading journal, my reading diary. I just use Goodreads to track what I'm reading over the course of a year. I would highly recommend doing something. It doesn't have to be Goodreads. It could just be a handwritten journal. It could be something you do on your own computer. It doesn't have to be public. It doesn't have to be integrated with social media or the internet. But develop some sort of tracking system. You would be amazed, or maybe you wouldn't, but I'm amazed at how easily I forget. Even though I track stuff on Goodreads, I'm amazed at how much I can forget. Like, oh yeah, I did read that book. When I go back through my records of reading, it brings things back to mind as I go back through my tracking, and that helps me remember what I read. But it also has helped me build towards the pace that I keep right now. It helps me hit the goals that I have every year because I track. If you don't track, you're not going to hit any goals because you're not going to be able to measure what you're reaching towards. So some sort of tracking system is really crucially important. That's my first piece of advice. Whether it's Goodreads or something else, there's lots of options. Okay, and then related to that, my second piece of advice is to develop a goal, like a practical, realistic, achievable, measurable goal. Develop a goal over time to figure out what you want to do. Is you want to figure out where you are now, and that also is why I think you should have a tracking system, because when you use a tracking system, you can figure out very, very practically, very realistically how many books you read right now. Like, how many books do you read in a month or in a year right now? You need to track that if you want to develop the skill. And then on top of that, you can measure where you're at now, and then you can use your tracking system to set a goal for where you'd like to be. And this cuts back to the second piece of thought I gave at the beginning of this video, which is that you want to think about this as a stretch over time, a skill to develop over time. Not be unrealistic about where you are right now and where you want to be. So figure out where you want to be. I titled this video How to Read 100 Books in a Year because that's my yearly goal. That's my yearly reading goal. I think that's what, based on comments I've gotten, questions I've gotten on YouTube, that's a lot of people would like to be able to do that themselves. So maybe that's your goal. But first, you got to figure out, what are you at now? How many books do you read right now? And I'll just say, if you read 10 to 20 books in a year right now, getting to 100 books is going to take probably a couple years. And you need to know that so that you don't get too demoralized or frustrated on your attempt to develop your reading skills. So let me give you some numbers. This is I went back through. This is my story with reading and how I got to where I'm at now. I've been using Goodreads for over 10 years. The first year that I had tracked every book that I read for that year was 2013. It's 2024 as I record this. So in 2013, I read 54 books over the course of that year. And again, that was the first time I'd tracked how many books I read in a year. So importantly, that was kind of my general reading rhythm just as it was going into tracking. I wasn't really trying to hit some sort of goal. I was just tracking what I was reading in my regular kind of rhythms. Read 54 books that year. In 2014, it dipped a little bit. I read 35 books in that year. In 2015, I read 66 books. And after 3 years of tracking and seeing those numbers like that, it was after 2015, it was in beginning of 2016 when I said, I bet, because I read 66 books that previous year, I thought to myself, I wonder if I could hit 100. That was the first time I had the thought of, like, I think I might actually try to read 100 books in a year this year, in the year 2016. And that was because I'd already hit over 60 the year before, without really pushing to try to read even more than that. And so in 2016, I hit 104 books. I read 104 books in 2016. Now, there is a little bit of an asterisk there because I chuckle a little bit as I say this, but the reason I hit 100 books that year is because I decided in December of 2016, I think this is humorous. In December of 2016, I decided to reread the Harry Potter series for the first time in a while. Actually, no, I did not decide to reread the whole series. I decided to just read the first book or two. And then, like that series does, it just took over my brain and I could not stop reading it, and ended up reading the entire 8 books the entire 7 books. And I think it was a period of 8 or 9 days. Just because I was like voraciously reading through them again. And because I did that in December, I read those 8 books in a little over a week, and that bumped me up over the 104 total. So if I hadn't done that, I might not have hit that goal. Be that as it may, I did hit 104 books in 2016, and then ever since then, every year after that, I've hit over 100 books. And actually, this past year, and it has ticked up a little bit year to year. And in 2023, I read over 135 books. So I'm kind of wondering, I don't know if I'm going to, this is end of January as I record this video. I don't know if I'm going to actually set this as a goal for myself, but my next kind of benchmark is going to be if I can read 150 books in a year. But that might not happen this year, it might happen next year. The point I'm trying to say here is that if you look at my story, it was multiple years of tracking, and then it was once I realized I was up close to 70 books in a year that I had the thought to try to push to get myself to 100. So I'm really trying to underline this point that it takes time. You have to approach it as a skill that you're going to develop over time. And then once you get within striking distance of 100 books, the next year might be the year that you can actually hit 100. So you have to think about it, and you have to measure it off of where you currently are. So track where you currently are, then develop a goal. And I would just say, 100 books in a year is a pace of about 2 books a week. Which for me is kind of my natural rhythm I'm in right now. But if you're nowhere near that, if you just read a book in a month right now, if that's just where you're at without really trying to push yourself, give yourself permission to be there, and then say, maybe I'm going to try to read 2 books in a month. I'm going to hit, 24 books next year, 25 books. And then maybe the year after that, you can push it up to 50. But again, I think you get the point now. I'm just really trying to underline this. And part of the reason I do this is because it can be so demoralizing to set this ambitious goal that's totally out of line and out of whack with where your current habits are. Okay, I've spent probably too much time on that point, but that's a really important one. Develop goals over time. Think about it as a goal to hit over time. Okay, now, third piece of practical advice is to figure out what are some rhythms that work for you, like rhythms in your day, rhythms in your week, rhythms in your year. Are your vacations, for example, a good time for you to read stuff or not? Or is that the time where you just totally take a break and check out and don't try to do any sort of, heavy reading? But then on a day-to-day level, and this is going to be taken into account your season of life, your temperament, your habits. There's a really interesting book called, I believe it's just called When by Daniel Pink, who's a science writer. I quite enjoyed this book, and he goes into, you might want to actually, if you're thinking about this, you might want to read that book. It's very easy to read, very insightful, but he goes into the science of how certain people's circadian rhythms and just like bodily rhythms kind of ebb and flow at different points in the day, and some people have different peaks in which peaks of energy hit. And so what's that look like for you? Do some self-assessment. Are you a morning person? Are you a night person? Where's your energy at its strongest? What's your season of life look like? Do you have kids or not? I have really little kids right now, so that affects when I wake up and when I don't sleep and such. But yeah, what's your season of life? What are your natural rhythms? When's your energy good? And factor that into, you are going to, if you want to get to 100 books a year, you don't want to read every day. And you want to figure out what does it look like, what kind of energy do you want to put towards your reading. So for me, I try to hit at least an hour of reading in the morning when I'm at my freshest. And that is typically, this is just my rhythms, that is typically when I read the heavier stuff. Nonfiction, almost exclusively nonfiction is what I read in the mornings. That might be some of the heavier theology or history or philosophy stuff that I'm trying to work through. And I read that thing kind of first thing in the morning because that's when my mental energy is at its freshest. Reading taxes your mind. And so for me, I cannot read that heavy stuff in the evenings. I just can't. I'm just too tired. I'm too worn down. There's lots of science behind how our willpower and our energy just like trails off by the end of the day. And so I can't pick up a heavy text in the evening. You might be able to. People are very different on that. But for me, I try to hit that at least an hour in the morning of like really, really sustained, focused reading. I don't have my phone. I haven't looked at my phone yet for the day. It's just as much as possible focus on what I'm reading. In the evenings is when I do try to read. That's when I read the lighter stuff. Maybe the lighter nonfiction, or I read a lot of fiction, and I typically read fiction in the evenings. It's not unusual for me to get another hour of reading in the evening. So, on an average day for me, that might be 2 hours of reading, totally outside of my work and family commitments in the middle of the day. But I've lined it up with, the certain types of reading based on the certain kind of energy that I have and the willpower that I have at that certain point in the day. And that works well for me. And I love Stephen King fiction, for example. That's like light stuff. I don't have to always be reading heavy, serious material. What is that for you? Is it poetry for you? I also love fantasy fiction. Is it fantasy fiction, or is it just literary fiction? Whatever it is, if it's just enjoyable for you, just put that into your evening reading. And I will also give a caveat here that I'm a pastor, and so my career does overlap with study. There's a decent amount of my time that is devoted towards study. So I do have a little bit of a leg up there. But on the other hand, I will say that surprisingly, of that 100 plus books in a year I read, a lot of those books are read in those hours at the beginning and the end of the day. Not a lot of it is accomplished in my day-to-day work life, because a lot of what I'm reading there are reference materials, things I'm preparing for teachings, and so on and so forth. So yeah, there you go. That's a little bit about my rhythms. I would strongly recommend, if you do the tracking system, you set a goal, I really strongly recommend looking into what do your daily rhythms look like. And then that feeds back into the thing I said earlier about what things you're going to sacrifice. So if you spend the morning, I don't know, if you spend the morning just kind of frittering away time on your phone looking at reading the news, maybe stop doing that and don't pick up your phone and read a book instead. And same thing in the evening. If you just like waste maybe a little bit too pejorative a term, but if you spend time on Netflix, just scanning streaming services or something to read, maybe read some easy, enjoyable fiction instead. And if you want to get to 100 books a year, you're not going to do that if you don't pick up something to read every day. I mean, it's got to be really built into your habits. And that goes into my next fourth piece of practical advice, which is always have a book with you. I don't go anywhere. I think I really mean that. As I say that, I'm even thinking out loud about it, but I pretty much don't go anywhere without a book. I have a work bag, like a shoulder bag, and anytime I leave the house, I grab one, sometimes even two books that are on my current reading list. I just stick them in the bag. And the reason I do that is because if I find myself, I don't know, in between meetings, or if I find myself waiting in a waiting room somewhere for an appointment, basically there's lots of little kind of chunks of time. Even it feels a little silly, but like when I go to a quick service oil change place, I'll be sitting in my car waiting for them to change my oil, and I'll be reading a book. This is maybe a little bit more idiosyncratic to me, but I do really recommend this. Like, always have a book with you, because you might be surprised at how many like little chunks of 10, 15, 20 minutes are in your day that typically, what do? We typically grab our phone, pull it out, and just zone out. What if instead of doing that, you pulled a book out of your bag and, I don't know, read a handful of pages while you were waiting for an appointment or whatever? You might be surprised at how much that adds up. So that's just a really personal piece of advice. Always have a book with you wherever you're going if you're really serious about, reading more. And then fifth and final piece of more practical advice, I guess this is less practical, but I think it's really important. And I would just say, remember that reading is, and hopefully should always be, a joyful pursuit. Don't let it become a massive burden, an albatross around your neck, so to speak, to where, I've got to hit my goal, and then where you stress yourself out. I've been there too. I've been there where I've just thought like, if I don't get this book done by tomorrow, I'm going to be behind on my goal. Or certain years I've been like, halfway through the year looking at my Goodreads, trying to see how many books I've read and if I'm on target, if I'm on pace. Really don't. If you're starting to go down that road, and speaking from experience, you're starting to go down that road, you've lost the plot, so to speak. Reading should be a joyful pursuit. It should be something that, adds value to your life, to the development of your mind, to your maturity. Don't let it become this thing that is a burden that you're carrying around. You don't really have anything to prove to the world. For me, once I realized I could hit 100 books in a year, and I did that consistently for a handful of years in a row, there's nothing really to prove after that. And so whatever that is for you, once you hit your goal, hit your goal because it's something because you love reading, and because you want to, improve the rhythms in your life. You want to expand your mind. You're never going to be able to read everything that's out there. Trust me on that. There is never going to be a life where you can read everything that you possibly want to read by the end. So do all of this. My guess is my encouragement, my personal encouragement, is to do all of this underneath the broader pursuit of just the joy of reading and the love of reading, and how much it can benefit you, because I really believe that it can. I really believe reading is a powerful way to not just develop your mind, but to develop your empathy, to develop your ability to see from other perspectives. That's one of the reasons I love reading fiction and love reading novels, because it's a powerful way to develop your emotional intelligence, your ability to empathize, see from other viewpoints. I just think there's so much to be said for reading, but it can also turn into, especially in our performance-driven age where we put everything out there for public scrutiny and public, to gain followers, gain whatever. And I recognize some irony in me putting this on YouTube, but just really try to hold that at bay. Take all of this advice under what should be reading for the joy of it. and not letting it become this thing that becomes really another job, or another chore, or like another burden that you carry around because you got to hit some goals that you develop for yourself. Give yourself grace, permission to just get better at reading, and it's okay. And it's okay if it takes some time. So those are my thoughts. Again, 5 pieces of practical advice. Develop a tracking system. Track what you're reading. Based on what you're tracking, develop a goal that's realistic, that's achievable, but that does stretch you a bit and gets you to where you want to be. Figure out the rhythms that work for your own reading and the styles of types of reading that will fit into those rhythms based on your energy, your stage of life. And then always carry a book with you. Always have some reading material with you, because you never know when opportunities to read are going to come up. And then finally, just remember, this is all for the joy and the pursuit of reading, because reading is just a wonderful thing. And it's we have this embarrassment of riches. I mean, I'm sitting in my office just surrounded by books. So we have this embarrassment of riches and the things that we can read. We're in an amazing time in history when you have access to so much incredible material to read. So just do it for the joy of it. So there you go. Those are my thoughts. Man, I hope that was helpful to some of you. I would love to hear if you have experiences with any of this stuff I just talked through. If you put any of this into practice and it helps you, I would love to hear that. That would be super encouraging to me, because, again, I'm doing all this because I have so much love of reading, and I would love to see more people develop a love and a skill for reading, because I think our world will be a better place, frankly. So, as always, thanks for taking some time to watch.